9:34 in the morning. April 18th, 1943. The sky above Bougainville is empty, blue, silent. 6,000 feet below, the jungle canopy stretches to the horizon, like a green sea that has forgotten what waves are. 16 twin-tailed aircraft cut through the humid air at 300 miles per hour, their silver wings catching sunlight in short, clean flashes. No radio, no formation chatter, only the low hum of 32 Allison engines running lean, running hot, running out of time. Two Japanese Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers approach from the northwest, escorted by 6 fighters. Inside the lead, Betty, an admiral in a white dress uniform, checks his pocket watch. His name is Isoroku Yamamoto. He is 59 years old. He has 3 minutes left to live. This is not a story about heroes. This is a story about a machine that made an entire empire flinch. If your father served in the Pacific, he knew this sound. Two Allison engines running counter to each other, cancelling their own torque. He may not have talked about the war. He may have gone to his grave without saying the name of this aircraft out loud. But when it flew over his airfield in 1943, he looked up. Every man looked up. They called it the fork-tailed devil. American pilots said the name came from the Japanese whispered in fear across the Solomons and New Guinea. But history has a way of getting simple things wrong. The nickname most likely began in North Africa, spoken by German Luftwaffe pilots who had never seen anything like it in European skies. The Japanese had their own name, Nihon no Akuma, the two-bodied demon. It appears in a handful of internal reports scratched onto the margins of intelligence memos spoken in the officers' mess at Rabaul. But the fork-tailed devil, that name traveled westward first and only later crossed the Pacific like a rumor that had grown teeth. Even the name is a lie history keeps telling itself. The aircraft was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. And to understand why it terrified a nation that had built its confidence on the wings of the Zero, you have to go back 6 years before Bougainville. Back to a drafting room in Burbank, California, where a 27-year-old engineer named Clarence Leonard Johnson, called Kelly by everyone who worked with him, stared at an impossible set of requirements. 1937. The United States Army Air Corps issued Circular Proposal X-608. They wanted a fighter that could climb to 20,000 feet in 6 minutes. They wanted 360 miles per hour at altitude. They wanted a machine that could stay in the air for 1 hour at full military power. Every other engineer in America looked at the numbers and shook their head. It could not be done with a single engine. Not in 1937. Kelly Johnson looked at the numbers and picked up a pencil. He drew 2 engines, 2 long booms stretching backward from the wings, each ending in a vertical tail. A small central pod for the pilot hanging in the middle like a bead threaded on a wire. No engineer had ever built a fighter this way. It looked wrong. It looked like a paper airplane a child would draw. When Johnson presented his design to the Army officers, one of them asked him if he was serious. He was. The prototype was called the XP-38. It rolled out of the Lockheed hangar in Burbank on New Year's Eve 1938, hidden under canvas moved at night to avoid attention. On February 11, 1939, Air Corps Lieutenant Ben Kelsey flew it across the country in a public relations stunt from California to New York in 7 hours and 2 minutes. He almost made it. On the final approach to Mitchell Field on Long Island, both engines lost power. The XP-38 came down short of the runway, hit a golf course fairway and broke apart. The prototype was destroyed. Kelsey walked away. The Army was thrilled anyway. The speed record had been set. Kelly Johnson watched the wreckage burn from the roof of the Lockheed plant 3,000 miles away, listening to the radio report. He asked for another chance. The Army gave him one. 2 years passed. 13 pre-production aircraft were built. Test pilots at March Field and Wright Field flew them harder, higher, faster. And one by one they began to notice something no one could explain. In a steep dive past 400 miles per hour, the controls would freeze. The stick would go rigid in the pilot's hands, as if the air itself had turned to concrete. The nose would tuck downward. The aircraft would refuse to pull up. Some pilots survived by bailing out at the last second. Others did not. On November 4, 1941, a test pilot named Ralph Werden climbed into a YP-38 over Glendale, California. He was 41 years old, a veteran of the airmail service, a man who had flown almost every experimental aircraft Lockheed had ever built. He knew the dive problem. He had been asked to investigate it. He rolled the Lightning onto its back at 22,000 feet and pushed the nose down. The aircraft accelerated, 400 miles per hour, 450, 500. The controls stiffened. Werden fought them. The tail assembly, according to witnesses on the ground, tore free from the boom in mid-air. The Lightning came apart above a residential neighborhood. Ralph Verden's body was found in the wreckage of a house on Elmwood Avenue. He had been alive when the tail broke. He had not been alive when the ground arrived. The phenomenon had a name, though it would take another 3 years to fully understand: compressibility. The rules of subsonic aerodynamics stopped working near the speed of sound, and the P-38, faster than any fighter in the world at high altitude, was the first American aircraft to meet that invisible wall. Werden was the first American pilot to die because of it. He was not the last. The engineers at Lockheed spent the next 2 years redesigning the wing, the elevator, the dive flaps. The problem was not fully solved until the P-38J model rolled out of the factory in 1944 with electrically actuated dive recovery flaps under the wings. By then, hundreds of pilots had already flown the earlier variants into combat. Some of them had died because their controls had turned to stone at 30,000 feet over the Pacific, and no one had told them why. This is a story about a machine that killed the men who built it and then went to war anyway. In late 1942, the first P-38F Lightnings arrived at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, delivered in pieces assembled under canvas painted olive drab. They belonged to the 339th Fighter Squadron, part of the newly formed 13th Air Force. Their pilots had trained in Australia. Some had never seen a Zero. Some had never flown at combat weight. Their commanding officers told them the aircraft was fast, heavy, and difficult to turn. Do not try to dogfight, they said. Do not fight the Japanese on their terms. The Japanese did not know this yet. The first intelligence reports on the P-38 reached the Imperial Navy Air Service through captured photographs and pilot debriefings. The reports described a twin-boom, twin-engine aircraft, heavy, apparently designed for long-range escort. A memo from the 6th Air Group at Rabaul, dated November 1942, described the Lightning as an American design of unusual configuration, likely intended for reconnaissance or bomber escort roles. Its size and weight suggest limited maneuverability in close combat. Not consider the first-line threat. Not consider the first-line threat. Those words would be quoted later in post-war analyses by Japanese officers who read them and winced. They had looked at the aircraft and seen what they wanted to see: big, slow, American. They had built their entire tactical doctrine on the assumption that agility beat firepower, that the tide-turning Zero would always find its opening, that American engineers made trucks and Japanese engineers made swords. The first time a Zero pilot tried to turn with a Lightning, he won. The second time the Lightning did not try to turn. The Lightning climbed, and climbed, and climbed, up past 25,000 feet, where the Zero's engine gasped for air. It could not find where the American pilot rolled. Inverted looked down at the tiny silhouette below him and dove. 1 second, 2 seconds, 700 feet per second falling. A single burst of gunfire from the nose, and the Zero was gone. They did not fight fair. The Japanese pilots wrote about it in letters home. Some of those letters survived. They describe a strange feeling. Not fear at first. Confusion. The American aircraft was not supposed to do this. It was supposed to be heavy and slow and easy to trap. Instead, it appeared from above, struck once, and vanished into the sun. The old rules did not apply. The old certainties did not apply. By January of 1943, the pilots of the 339th were flying escort missions from Guadalcanal to Munda and beyond. They were losing aircraft. They were losing friends. They were also learning. And 2,000 miles to the south, in a briefing room at Pearl Harbor, A small team of Navy cryptographers was staring at a decoded Japanese naval message and calling for the officer on watch. The message contained an itinerary. The itinerary belonged to an admiral. The Americans learned to fight in 3 dimensions. The Japanese fought in 2. That was the difference. That was the whole difference. Every Zero pilot who lifted off from Rabaul in the winter of 1943 had been trained to think of air combat as a duel on a horizontal plane. You circled, you maneuvered, you pulled inside your opponent's stern until you had the shot. It was elegant, it was traditional. It had worked against Chinese biplanes over Shanghai, against Wildcats over Wake Island, against Hurricanes over Singapore. It did not work against the P-38. The tactic the Americans developed had a name: boom and zoom. It sounded like a children's game. It killed men by the hundreds. A flight of Lightnings would climb to 30,000 feet higher than any Japanese fighter could comfortably reach and wait. When they spotted a formation of Zeros or Betis below them, they would push over into a screaming dive. 500 miles per hour. 550. The Lightning's 4 Browning 50 caliber machine guns and 1 Hispano 20mm cannon were mounted in the nose, not the wings. That mattered more than most pilots understood at first. On a wing-mounted fighter, the guns converged at a fixed distance, usually 200 yards. Miss that range, and the bullets flew past the target. On the Lightning, every round traveled parallel to the pilot's line of sight. From 1,000 yards away, the pilot could put a stream of tracers into a single square meter of Japanese aircraft. The Zero pilot would see nothing. Then he would see a flash. Then he would be dead. The Lightning would keep diving past the target all the way down to 15,000 feet, using the momentum to climb again out of reach before the Japanese formation could react. If the Zeros tried to follow, their engines lost power in the thin air. If they turned to fight, they could not close the distance. The Americans had rewritten the rules. They had taken the vertical axis away from the Japanese, and there was no way to take it back. In August of 1942, months before the P-38 arrived in strength, a Japanese pilot named Saburo Sakai had been shot in the face over Guadalcanal. He was 26 years old. He had grown up in a village in Saga Prefecture, the son of a farmer who died when Saburo was 11. He had joined the Imperial Navy at 16 because his family could not feed him. By 1942, he had already shot down more than 60 Allied aircraft. He was by any measure one of the finest fighter pilots alive. On August 7th, over the invasion beaches at Guadalcanal, he mistook a formation of American TBF Avengers for Wildcats. He climbed into their rear gunners' arcs. A single .30 caliber round punched through the windscreen of his Zero, struck him above the right eye and destroyed the vision in it forever. Blood filled his instrument panel. He could not see the horizon. He flew 4 hours and 47 minutes back to Rabaul, half blind, half conscious, one hand holding a scarf against his skull to stop the bleeding. He landed the Zero. He walked to the medical tent. He did not fly for almost 2 years. When he returned to combat in 1944, half his depth perception gone, he flew against the P-38. In his memoir published in 1957 under the title Samurai Sakai, wrote a single sentence about the Lightning. It comes down like something that has no interest in a fair fight. It appears. It kills. It leaves. He did not write those words with contempt. He wrote them with a kind of tired respect. Because here was the thing. Japanese pilots were trained in Bushido, the code of the warrior. Combat was supposed to be an art, an encounter between men who acknowledged each other's skill. The turning dogfight was the highest expression of that code. 2 aircraft spiraling, circling, testing each other, until one man's nerve broke or one man's engine coughed at the wrong moment. It was a duel with wings. The P-38 refused the duel. And the code that had made Japanese naval aviation the most feared in the Pacific in 1941 became the code that killed its pilots in 1943. They kept trying to bring the Americans into a turning fight. The Americans kept climbing away. Every mission the Japanese lost a few more veterans. Every mission the veterans they lost had been training pilots at Yokosuka 6 months earlier. The Zero was the same aircraft it had always been. The men flying it were not. 2 of the Americans who flew the P-38 over New Guinea in those months would become the two highest scoring American aces of the entire war. Richard Bong was 22 years old, a farm boy from Poplar, Wisconsin, quiet, freckled, small enough that he had to sit on a cushion to see over the instrument panel. His commanding officers said he was the worst gunnery student they had ever seen. He could not shoot. He got so close to his targets that he sometimes flew through the debris. When one of his kills was confirmed, after he came home covered in oil and metal fragments, his squadron mates asked him what happened. He said, "I don't know. I got close and pulled the trigger." He finished the war with 40 confirmed kills. He is still the highest scoring American fighter pilot in history. Thomas Maguire was 22 years old, from Ridgewood, New Jersey, tall, thin, difficult, disliked by many of the men who flew with him. He carried a photograph of his wife Marilyn in his flight jacket. He wore two crash helmets stacked on top of each other because he thought it looked distinctive. He was competitive with Bong in a way that everyone around him could see and that no one wanted to talk about. He finished the war with 38 confirmed kills, second only to Bong. On January 7, 1945, over the island of Los Negros, in the Philippines, Maguire led a flight of 4 P-38s on a low-level fighter sweep. They ran into a single Japanese Ki-43 Oscar flown by a pilot named Akira Sugimoto. Sugimoto was not a famous ace. He was competent. He was patient. He was defending his home. Maguire had a personal rule. His squadron mates knew it by heart. Never turn tight with a Japanese fighter below 3,000 feet. Never. The P-38 was heavy. It stalled early. In a slow tight turn near the ground, the Zero and the Oscar and the Frank could all outturn it, and if you stalled, you had no altitude to recover. When Sugimoto latched onto the tail of one of Maguire's wingmen at 500 feet, Maguire violated his own rule to save the man's life. He hauled his Lightning into a hard left turn. He was carrying two full drop tanks. He had not jettisoned them. The aircraft stalled. It fell out of the sky. There was no room to pull up. Thomas Maguire died in a rice paddy on the north end of Los Negros. He was 24 years old. His wife received a telegram 3 weeks later. He was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. The citation praised his courage. It did not mention the drop tanks. The best pilots die because of the mistakes only the best pilots are capable of making. That is not a legend. That is a fact. 2,000 miles to the north on April 13th, 1943, a Japanese naval radio operator at Rabaul transmitted a coded message. The code was called JN-25. It was the primary operational code of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Americans had been reading it in fragments since the Battle of Midway. They read this message. The message was an itinerary. On the morning of April 18th, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy, would fly from Rabaul to Balalai Island, in the Solomons, to inspect forward units. He would depart at 6 o'clock in the morning. He would be aboard a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber. He would be escorted by 6 Zero fighters. He would arrive at 8 o'clock. The itinerary specified minutes. The decoded transcript reached Admiral Chester Nimitz at Pearl Harbor within hours. Nimitz was 60 years old. He had known Yamamoto by reputation for decades. The historical record on who authorized the mission is unclear. Some accounts point to Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, some to President Roosevelt himself. What is not disputed is the order that reached the pilots. According to accounts from his staff, Nimitz gave the order in 3 words: "Get Yamamoto." Only one American aircraft in the entire Pacific theater had the range to do it. The distance from Kukum Field on Guadalcanal to the interception point off Bougainville, on a route that would avoid Japanese radar and coast watchers, was roughly 1,000 statute miles round trip. The Wildcat could not do it. The Corsair could not do it. The P-40 could not do it. Only the P-38G, fitted with 165-gallon and 310-gallon drop tanks, could fly that far and still have fuel to fight. The mission was assigned to the 339th Fighter Squadron. Its commander was Major John William Mitchell. He was 28 years old. He came from Enid, Mississippi. He had spent the last 2 nights sleeping on the ground, next to his aircraft, planning the intercept with a slide rule, a chart and a naval navigator's watch borrowed from a submarine officer. The Army Air Force's watches were not accurate enough. The margin for error was less than a minute. Mitchell picked 18 pilots. 16 would fly cover. 2 would be the killers. The killers were First Lieutenant Rex Barber, 25 from Culver, Oregon, a rancher's son with a slow voice and steady hands, and First Lieutenant Thomas Lanphier, Jr., 27 from California, the son of a colonel, a graduate of Stanford, ambitious in a way that his fellow pilots noticed and did not always appreciate. They took off from Kukum Field at 7:25 in the morning on April 18, 1943. 2 aircraft aborted with mechanical trouble in the first hour. 16 continued. They flew 50 feet above the surface of the Pacific for 435 miles in radio silence, in a wide dogleg to the west to avoid Japanese observation posts. The fuel gauges dropped. The pilots did not speak. The sun climbed toward its noon position over Bougainville. At 9:34 in the morning, exactly 1 minute ahead of the calculated intercept, John Mitchell looked to his right and saw 2 Betty bombers, painted dark green, flying at 4,500 feet, escorted by 6 Zeros exactly where the code breakers had said they would be. He broke the radio silence with 2 words. Bogies. 11 o'clock. Barber and Lanphier climbed to attack. What happened in the next 4 minutes has been argued about for 80 years. Both men fired on the elite Betty. Both men claimed the kill. Lanphier, after the war, would tell a story about breaking off to fight the Zeros, then rolling in on the bomber from above and cutting off its wing with a single burst. Barber told a different story. He said Lanphier turned away and never touched the lead bomber. He said Barber chased the Betty at treetop level over the jungle, put a long burst into the right engine, watched it catch fire, watched the bomber roll onto its back, watched it strike the trees. The wreckage was found the following morning by a Japanese search party led by Lieutenant Hamasuna. Admiral Yamamoto was still strapped into his seat, thrown clear of the bomber by the impact, his white-gloved hands folded on the hilt of the samurai sword he had carried since Etajima. He had been struck by 250 caliber rounds. One had entered his lower left jaw. One had entered his left shoulder. Either would have killed him. He was 59 years old. The Japanese government kept the death secret for 34 days. When the announcement came on May 21, 1943, the entire nation went into official mourning. In Tokyo, women wept in the streets. Soldiers stood at attention in front of shop windows. The emperor sent a personal message of condolence to Yamamoto's widow. No one in Japan was told the truth about how he had died. They were told the submarine had ambushed the aircraft. They were told it had been an accident. They were not told about the P-38, about Mitchell's slide rule, about the code breakers at Pearl Harbor, about the American pilot who chased a bomber through the trees over Bougainville, while a vice admiral named Matome Ugaki in the second Betty watched Yamamoto's aircraft burn and thought his own life was ending too. Ugaki survived. His bomber crash-landed in the sea. He was pulled from the wreckage with multiple fractures and severe injuries. He returned to Japan. On August 15, 1945, hours after Emperor Hirohito's surrender, broadcast reached the airfield. Ugaki put on his flight suit, climbed into a dive bomber, and flew toward Okinawa on a personal kamikaze mission. He was never found. The dispute over who killed Yamamoto lasted 42 years. In 1985, the United States Air Force officially reviewed the evidence, including the physical wreckage of the Betty bomber, which had been examined by American investigators at the crash site in the 1970s. The bullet holes told the story. The angle of the rounds, the pattern of the fire, the damage to the right engine. The evidence favored Rex Barber. The Air Force compromised. They gave half the credit to each pilot. Thomas Lanphier died 2 years later in 1987, still insisting that he had made the kill. Rex Barber died in 2001. In interviews late in his life, Barber kept coming back to one detail. The color of the jungle, the green. He always came back to the green. Yamamoto's death did not end the war in the Pacific. It did something quieter and in some ways worse. It broke a spell. For 18 months, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been fighting on the memory of its own greatness. Pearl Harbor, Singapore, the Java Sea. The names had become talismans, and behind those names in the mind of every officer and every sailor and every mechanic on every airfield, from Truk to Rabaul, stood a single figure, the man who had planned it all, the man who had told the emperor before the war began that he could give them 6 months of victories, and after that he could promise nothing. He had given them 16. Then the Americans killed him in the sky above Bougainville, and the empire went on fighting because empires do not know how to stop. But something in the machinery had come loose. The man who replaced Yamamoto was Admiral Mineichi Koga. He was a competent officer. He was not Yamamoto. On March 31st, 1944, less than a year after taking command, Koga's aircraft flew into a typhoon between the Palau Islands and the Philippines and was never seen again. He was 58 years old. His body was never recovered. The Japanese Navy had lost 2 commanders-in-chief in 11 months, both aboard aircraft, one shot down by Americans, one erased by weather. The men who read those reports in the operations rooms at Yokosuka understood what the reports meant. The sky was no longer theirs. The P-38 kept flying. The Japanese tried to build something to stop it. The Kawasaki Ki-61 Hien called Tony by the Americans was a beautiful aircraft, an inline engine fighter that could match the Lightning at medium altitudes. It arrived in numbers in 1943. It was too few. Its engine was unreliable. The Mitsubishi J2M Raiden called Jack was a purpose-built interceptor with the climb rate and firepower to reach the American bombers at high altitude. It arrived in 1944. It was also too few. By the time these aircraft reached the front lines, Japan had already lost the men who could have flown them properly. The veteran pilots were dead. The training pipeline was in ruins. The fuel was rationed. The engines wore out faster than they could be replaced. Every Lightning that took off from Dobodura or Nadzab or Morotai in 1944 met a Japanese pilot with half the flight hours of the man who had trained him. And that Japanese pilot met a Lightning flown by an American who had statistically twice the training hours of any American who had flown against Sakai's generation at Guadalcanal. The gap was not going to close. The gap was going to widen until the war ended. In 1956, 11 years after the surrender, a former Japanese naval officer named Masatake Okumiya sat down at a desk in Tokyo and began writing a book. He had served on the staff of the 3rd Fleet planning air operations, watching the tide turn from a series of chart tables that grew emptier every month. He had lived. Many of his friends had not. He collaborated with 2 other men, Jiro Horikoshi, the aeronautical engineer who had designed the Zero, and Martin Kaidin, an American aviation writer. The book they produced was called Zero, and it was one of the first serious accounts of the Pacific Air War, written from the Japanese perspective. It was translated into English. Americans read it. Something in it surprised them. Okumiya devoted an entire chapter to the P-38. He did not call it clumsy. He did not call it heavy. He did not repeat the dismissive language of the 6th Air Group memo from 1942. He wrote something else. He wrote that the Lightning was the American aircraft his colleagues had feared most. Not the Hellcat, which had killed more Japanese aircraft in total. Not the Corsair, which had been the terror of the ground attack pilots. The Lightning, the one they had underestimated at the start and had never quite figured out how to counter, and had watched mission after mission appear at altitudes the Zero could not reach, strike at speeds the Oscar could not match, and leave before the interceptors could climb to meet it. He wrote about respect. He wrote about the strange feeling of admiring a weapon that had killed men you knew. Saburo Sakai, in his own memoir, would say something similar. When he returned to combat in 1944, half-blind flying a modified Zero, with an optical sight adjusted for his one working eye, he encountered P-38s over Iwo Jima. He wrote about the encounter with the same tired precision he had used for everything else in the book. The Lightnings came from above. They fired once. They climbed away. He tried to follow. He could not. He wrote a single line about that day, and it may be the truest sentence anyone on either side of the war ever wrote about the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. If we had built it first, everything would have been different. That is the shocking truth. Not that Japan hated the lightning, not that they laughed at its strange shape, or dismissed its performance, or found it easy to defeat. The shocking truth, the one that took 40 years for the surviving pilots to speak aloud, was that they respected it. Deeply, silently, across an ocean and across a lifetime. They had built their air force on the wings of the Zero. They had believed in agility over armor, in the sword, over the shield, in the honor of the turning duel. And they had watched from the beginning of 1943 until the end, as an American engineer's impossible drawing a design they had initially called Clumsy, in their own intelligence reports, dismantled their doctrine one mission at a time. It did not fight fair. It did not need to. And in the end, they understood something that the Americans drunk on victory did not always understand about themselves. The lightning had won because it had changed the rules, not because it was more beautiful, not because it was more honorable, because it was faster and higher, and it did not care. Richard Bong came home in January of 1945, 40 confirmed kills, the highest score in American aviation history. He was 24 years old. He had a wife named Marge, whose name he had painted on the nose of his last P-38 over New Guinea. General Douglas MacArthur pinned the Medal of Honor on his chest at a ceremony at Tacloban. The photographers said he looked embarrassed. He said he wanted to go home. They would not let him go back to combat. He was too valuable as a symbol. They assigned him to Wright Field and then to Lockheed's factory in Burbank, California, where a new aircraft was being tested. The P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter. Bong flew it 11 times. On August 6, 1945 at 8:15 in the morning, a B-29 named Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon Pacific time at Lockheed Air Terminal in Burbank, Richard Bong climbed into a P-80 for a routine test flight. 20 seconds after takeoff, the primary fuel pump failed. The engine flamed out at 400 feet. He tried to bail out. He was too low. The parachute did not have time to open. He was killed on impact in a vacant lot across from a Lockheed employee parking area. The next morning's newspapers ran two headlines side by side. Hiroshima destroyed by atomic bomb. Top ace Richard Bong killed testing new jet. Some editors ran the stories under a single banner. Some ran a photograph of the mushroom cloud above one column and a photograph of a young man in a leather flight jacket above the other. Bong's mother was called by a reporter before the army chaplain reached her home. She learned of her son's death from a stranger on the telephone. She did not speak for a long time. He was 24 years old. He had shot down 40 Japanese aircraft. He was killed by an American engine in an American factory on the day an American weapon killed 70,000 Japanese civilians. The war ended 8 days later. It did not end for the Bong family. 10,037 P-38 Lightnings rolled off the Lockheed production lines between 1939 and 1945. More Japanese aircraft were destroyed by the Lightning than by any other American fighter in the Pacific theater. The exact number is disputed. It is in the low thousands. Every one of those numbers had a name attached to it, and a family and a village and a mother who did not learn for months what had happened to her son. That is true on both sides of the war. It is always true. 26 P-38 survive today. Only 8 of them are still airworthy. When they fly at air shows in California or Oshkosh or Duxford, the sound they make is unmistakable. 2 Allison engines running counter-rotating, cancelling each other's torque. Old men in the crowd turn their heads before they see the aircraft. They know the sound. Some of them stand up. Some of them do not say why. In 1982, Saburo Sakai visited the United States for the first time. He was 65 years old. He had lived through the firebombing of Tokyo, the surrender, the American occupation, the Reconstruction. He had grown old. He had raised a daughter. He had written more books. He had spent 40 years thinking about the men he had killed and the men who had killed his friends. At a gathering in San Diego, arranged by a veterans organization, he met a group of former American fighter pilots. Some had flown Wildcats. Some had flown Corsairs. Some had flown Lightnings. He was introduced to each of them by name. He bowed to each of them. He did not speak. When one of the American pilots asked him through an interpreter what he wanted to say to the men he had once fought, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said only the war is over. We are all pilots now. That is the story. Not the story of a machine though. The machine is at the center of it. Not the story of a war though. The war is what the machine was built for. It is the story of what men choose to say about their enemies once the fighting is over and the noise has stopped and the sky is only the sky again. The shocking truth about what Japan thought of the P-38 Lightning was never really about the aircraft. It was about the silence that followed it into the years after the war and the respect that grew slowly in that silence from men who had once tried to kill each other and had lived long enough to understand what that meant. The forked-tailed devil is mostly gone now. A few of them still fly. Their pilots are careful with them. They land them gently. They keep the tanks half full. Somewhere in a hangar in Chino, California, one of the last airworthy Lightnings sits under fluorescent lights, its silver wings polished, its nose guns removed. A crew chief walks past it every morning and touches the aluminum. He does not know why. His father flew one of these in 1944. His father did not talk about it. The old men are almost all gone now. The aircraft remembers what they cannot say.